Welcome to the Global Justice Report, an online production of the Center for Global Justice. I'm Cliff Durand, your host for today's program. The Center for Global Justice, El Centro para la Justicia Global, is a multinational and bilingual research center located in San Miguel de Allende, Mexico. The center is devoted to research and learning for a better world and empowering a solidarity economy. Due to the pandemic, we've discontinued our in-person events and instituted these webinars instead. And so we, without the revenue-generating in-person events, we urge you to make donations. You can donate at globaljusticecenter.org. Today's program, we are pleased to have as our speaker, Phyllis Bennis, who is author. She's with the Institute for Policy Studies in Washington, and is also a fellow of the Transnational Institute in Amsterdam. She's written and edited 11 books, and among them is her latest is Understanding the Palestinian-Israeli Conflict. She will be talking today about militarized imperialism. You know, imperialism used to be a dirty word, you know, it's seldom spoken in public in regard to the U.S., but now it's widely recognized as the heart of U.S. policy. So we will give the floor to Phyllis, and after that, the opportunity for you to raise questions and make your comments. So take it away, Phyllis.
Thanks very much, Cliff, and thank you all for inviting me. It's good to be with the Global Justice Center. I'm sorry I'm not in San Miguel, but we'll make do. I was going to talk today about militarization and militarism. It is about imperialism, but I find that most people don't use that language, so it's not generally, for me, all that useful to make that the framework, although I'll reference it in a little bit. But the issue of militarism and the militarization of parts of society at various times has been central, as many of you know, to the US from the time of its creation as a settler colony in this land. And the militarism allowed the genocide against indigenous people to go forward. It made it possible to enforce slavery as an economic gain. It made possible the expansion west, even beyond the ocean borders, to the Philippines and Guam and Hawaii and Puerto Rico and all the other places that the US colonized 150 and 200 years ago. It was inherent in the imposition of Jim Crow segregation in this country. So militarism has been really central in US history from the beginnings. When we talk about foreign policy, there have been different times, and militarization of foreign policy is something that has its rising and its falling at various times. And I would say in the last 20 years, the last 25 years or so, we have seen an extraordinary rise in the militarization of US foreign policy across the board. The wars that have been fought, not only about resources, but certainly resources being a central component. The Iraq War, of course, was certainly about oil, but it was never only about oil. It was also about military bases being established. It was about the projection of power. It was about the establishment of regional and global military alliances. It was about a whole bunch of things, even beyond the claim of resource control. But what we see right now in the midst of that militarized foreign policy is that at the level of global concerns, the global situation is not only terrible in a whole bunch of ways, but it's really very complicated. We have the complications of wars that are springing up all over the place. The war in Ukraine, of course, is not the only war that's raging around the world. The massive increase in pandemics, most notably, of course, through the COVID years, these last 3 years, the expansion and rise of inequality and poverty in the US and globally, the huge climate crisis, which of course is a global phenomenon overwhelmingly impacting the most vulnerable all around the world, and the refugee crises that are caused by these crises of climate, of inequality, of poverty, and of war. All of these things create more refugees. The refugee flows create refugee crises. And on top of that, now we have this crisis of authoritarianism around the world, with more and more governments moving in either a sort of right-wing populist way or in a straight-up militarization component, where we have authoritarian governments on the rise, both in places that have traditionally been authoritarian or repressive or whatever adjective you want to use, including key US allies, whether we're talking about Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and others, but also countries that have long histories of democratic shifts in power, shifts between parties, et cetera, where suddenly authoritarian parties are coming to power through votes, through parliamentary votes. So we're seeing that we saw that in Brazil. Until now, it's been reversed with the re-election of Lula, but the years of Bolsonaro, like the years of Trump here, where we brought to power an authoritarian regime, put in place a whole bunch of institutionalized changes that are making everything worse. And we're seeing it in places like the Philippines and Turkey and India, which have democratic systems in place. If you define democracy as primarily about elections, but suddenly they've all elected authoritarian governments, which may be turned out in the next election, maybe won't. Maybe if they are, they won't agree, they won't concede, they won't allow a new government to take power. All of these things are shaking up the kind of complacency in the post-Cold War era that made it seem that these democratic structures were pretty much invincible, that we weren't going to see the rise of fascism reemerging. And whether we see fascism consolidating anywhere yet, we have not seen that, but I don't think anyone can argue that it's not certainly a possibility. So the complications are very extreme. And in answering those complications, US policy in recent years, and this goes back way before Trump, has been extraordinarily militarized. We see the clearest example, perhaps less in the actual wars that the US has been fighting in the context of the so-called global war on terror that meant real hot wars in Iraq, in Afghanistan, in Somalia, in Libya, in Syria, in a bunch of places around the world. But also, if you look at, for example, the creation of AFRICOM, the African Command, the US military divides the world, and each part of the world comes under the jurisdiction of a US military branch. So the African Command was created in, I guess it was shortly after 9/11, it was around 2002 or 3, something like that, when they decided that Africa hadn't been getting enough attention. So what kind of attention do we need? We need the attention of a military branch of the US Pentagon. So they created Africa Command, or AFRICOM, which of course is not based in Africa because no African country other than one would agree to host it. And the US was not about to move to Liberia for its headquarters. So they moved to Germany and established the headquarters there. But what we see with AFRICOM is that virtually all US policy, economic policy, humanitarian policy, health-related policy, like the aid, the assistance for AIDS prevention, all of it goes through AFRICOM now. It's the leading direction of how US policy in Africa works. And the effect of that, of course, is to distort terribly the question of where money goes in this country, so that we're still faced with a situation where 53 cents of every federal dollar goes directly to the military. And we're spending so much there that when people argue, well, we just don't have enough money to pay for healthcare for everyone. On the one hand, we know that's not true. And we've seen it in the context of the COVID response, where suddenly there was a lot of money available that never had been before. But at the same time, you also know that there's a certain logic that when you're spending 53 cents of every dollar on the military, and that's not even counting things like nuclear weapons that don't come out of the Pentagon budget, they come out of the energy budget. So it's way more than that. But the official congressionally mandated money that goes directly to the Pentagon is 53 cents of every dollar. It's not so illogical to say, well, maybe there's not really enough money for things like healthcare and jobs and education, the things that actually protect our people. So what we're seeing globally is a situation where the US is no longer a unipolar world, as it was for some time after the Cold War. The Soviet Union collapses, the US emerges as the sole superpower, goes to war in Iraq the first time around in 1991, more or less to prove to the rest of the world that it was still a superpower, regardless of whether its sparring partner had collapsed or not. And that lasted about a decade. But then suddenly, using the excuse of 9/11, which was a horrific crime against humanity, but by instead of calling it a crime against humanity, calling it an act of war, it gave the US the sort of credential, self-generated credential, to go to war with the world and to say that we are still the military superpower in the world. That hasn't changed. In many ways, the US goal is still the maintaining of that kind of military domination. Whether it's possible or not these days remains a big question. But supremacy over China, especially, and somewhat over Russia, still remain key components of US military strategy. One of the things that's so extraordinarily dangerous right now is that, unlike earlier periods that get defined, you know how when you read history of the US, you see periods defined by the wars. There was the World War I era. Then there was the World War II period. Then there was the Cold War. Then there was the Vietnam era. Then, so it goes, they're all defined because each time there's a new war, you leave behind the other wars until now. We're now, we hear a lot about we're now in the era of, what do they like to call it? The near-peer conflict, near-peer competition, meaning we're going after the big guys. We're not going after little countries around in the global south. We're going after the most powerful countries in the world, China and Russia. But at the same time, even though we're not hearing much about it, the wars of the global war on terror are still continuing. We saw the disastrous impact of the way that the incredibly necessary but badly implemented withdrawal from Afghanistan happened. There's still US troops fighting in Iraq. There's still US troops in Syria. The nature of those wars has been changing for some years. They're no longer characterized by giant deployments of tens of thousands of troops at a time, hundreds of thousands over the years. Instead, it's overall reliance militarily on airstrikes and drones, much cheaper. And crucially, you hardly have any US military casualties. And if you don't have US military casualties, nobody pays attention. So if there's a lot of Iraqi casualties or Afghan casualties, nobody's all that interested because it's not US blood that's being shed. And that's where the intersection of racism and militarism comes to a head. If it's not US blood, US citizens who are dying, then the press doesn't tend to cover it. And if the press isn't covering it, nobody pays much attention. We see the distinction of that with the war in Ukraine, which I'll get to in a minute. But one of the points about it is that the extraordinary 24/7 coverage of that war, unlike any war I can remember, not like Vietnam, not like Iraq, not like Afghanistan, nowhere did you see mainstream coverage of that extraordinary up close and personal nature 24/7 in this country, so that everybody is seeing what war looks like. So just for that reason, it's not surprising that so many people are taking an absolutist position of embracing the Ukrainian cause. It's about other things as well. It has to do with racism, the fact that these are white people and they're not people of color that are being targeted. It has to do with the fact that the quote enemy is Russia, and it's easy for people in this country to remember when Russia used to be the Soviet Union and they were the bad guys, and so it's an easy shift. All of that is important. But it also has to do with something that I think ironically gives us a great example, which is that every war in the world should be covered like this. Every war, we should be seeing the victims up close and personal and hearing their stories of how they were forced to leave their elderly parents who couldn't leave, and they don't know if they're still alive or not. Children separated from their parents, not by the wall at our border, but by a war. It happens all the time. It happened all the time in Iraq, in Afghanistan, in Somalia, in all of the places where the US was fighting wars, using its military power in the context of the so-called global war on terror. And yet we never saw that close up. We never really thought about those wars in the context of what was the human cost that was being paid. So in a perverse kind of way, the war in Ukraine gives us that model. That's part of what we need to do to challenge militarism, as the core of our foreign policy, is to say, that's what it looks like. That's what these wars look like. So we're talking about imperialism. Yes, US is still an imperialist country. It has different wings and there's different views of what that should look like in terms of policy. One of the big differences we have now is that the US is defining as its quote enemies countries like Russia, like China. China, of course, defines itself as a communist country. I would assert that China is in fact a capitalist country. State capitalism, it's a different kind of capitalism, but it's capitalism nonetheless. It's about profit. It's about building up a wealthy middle class. It's about making millionaires. Whether it's imperialist or not, I think is dicey. I don't think that capitalism either in Russia or China have risen to the point that Lenin used to define imperialism as the quote highest stage of capitalism. But I don't think focusing on the definition is all that critical. So I don't think that really matters very much what we call it. What we see is that this is a very dangerous moment in world history where major economic powers and the two leading nuclear powers are fighting a war with each other. That's incredibly dangerous. You know, since 1991, with the US emergence as the sole superpower, in the period since then, that's about 30 years. In the last 20 years, we've seen China rising as a serious military competitor to the United States. More an economic competitor, but a military competitor nonetheless. China's military budget is second only to the US. But let's be clear, China's military budget is about $250 billion a year. The US military budget is close to $1 trillion a year. So it's not even close. It's not even close. But no other country is even at that level. Russia, if you want to talk about Russia's military capacity, Russia spends about $60 billion a year on its military. That's including its nuclear weapons, right? So when the US says that we've already sent, it's actually $65 billion to Ukraine just to fight back against this military whose entire budget is that amount, you see what the disparities are in terms of who who has the military capacity. So if we put aside the military side and look at this question of how the militarism is used these days, with the language that we hear is a lot about democracy versus autocracy. It's in some ways an interesting and not a bad discussion, because there is a rise in autocratic regimes. There is a rise in authoritarianism around the world, without doubt. The problem isn't how it gets defined. The way the US uses that dichotomy is a little bit weird, more than a little bit weird. So you have the United States for 4 years, we had elected an incredibly authoritarian leader who imposed a whole host of things that attacked the rights of people who were the most impacted in our country, who were the most vulnerable, people of color, immigrants, Muslims. The most vulnerable parts of our population were the ones who paid the biggest price for that kind of autocratic approach that Trump brought to it. With the defeat of Trump in 2020, even with the Trumpism that has survived and the efforts to deny the results of the election and all of that, we do have the capacity to begin the process of reversing some of that, but it's going to take a while. That's not something you can easily do. It's much easier to create those institutionalized shifts. When Trump was able to not only appoint, but get approval in the Senate for over 200 right-wing judges vetted by the Federalist Association, who are committed to appointing only judges who wanted to overturn Roe v. Wade, who want to cut back on the right to vote, all of those things. Getting in enough judges to challenge that, that's not so easy. That's not so easy. And what we see is that in countries around the world, we have not only the countries that are longstanding autocratic countries like Saudi Arabia, like the UAE, longstanding allies of the United States, who we never sort of said, oh, we can't deal with them because they're autocrats. Well, being autocrats, being absolute monarchies never stopped us before. And it certainly isn't stopping us now. The problem is now we also have, when you look at where are the autocrats rising? Where are these people in power? You're looking at Hungary, a European country. You're looking at Poland. Nobody says anything bad about Poland right now because they were very good to the Ukrainian refugees. People are glad to say bad things about Orban in Hungary, but that's problematic because it's a European country, right? The other countries, Brazil, when Bolsonaro was in charge, it was disastrous for the people of Brazil, particularly for the indigenous community, and most especially for the Amazon basin itself, which was attacked brutally by this autocratic regime. Lula is going to have a huge challenge to overturn some of what he did in other countries as well, where there is an elected autocrat, whether it's the Philippines, it is possible that they will be kicked out of office sometime later, but at what cost? And again, the US responds in a military way, in terms of building up its military in the South China Sea, challenging China, the level of militarization of the aid to Ukraine. Not all of the $65 billion has been military, but the vast majority of it has been. It's more than 2/3 of it has been military aid directly. That's something that the US has never provided to any other country, even to Israel, with its continual almost $4 billion a year that it gets in direct military aid. 20% of the entire Israeli military budget we pay just writing a check every year. But there's never been this level of military aid to another country without any kind of accountability. And what we're seeing, of course, because of the way that militarism has so much taken over the discourse about all of this, is that we see that even discussing the possibility of diplomacy, even alongside militarized aid, let alone replacing it, is considered absolutely prohibited. So when the Progressive Caucus, you all probably heard about this a few weeks ago, issued a public letter calling on Biden with 30 signatures of members of Congress, calling on Biden, very carefully supporting everything he's done to support the Ukrainian military resistance, but saying, shouldn't we be thinking about some kind of a diplomatic track as well, not even instead of, as I might have said, but as well, leaving the military component in place, but adding a diplomatic proposal to it. There was outrage, and the outrage was so intense and so vicious that the Progressive Caucus very quickly withdrew the proposal because it was seen as politically suicidal to maintain it. So there's a huge challenge here. And what we're seeing, and this will come into the question of Ukraine, we're seeing this question of the abandonment of international law as having any impact. What we hear instead, and this is pretty new for the last 3 or 4 years, what we hear is about the rules-based order, the international rules-based order. That's what we're following. Nobody talks about international law anymore. Now, why is that? What's the difference? So the difference is international law exists. It's problematic in a whole host of ways. It reflects the power relations of the post-World War II era. And a lot of it was drafted in between 1945 and 1949 by the victors of World War II. But nonetheless, it's existing law that you can point to, you can challenge, you can say this should be implemented. It means the UN Charter, it means the Geneva Conventions. It means all of these things that actually exist in the real world, that are written down, that countries join the treaties that enforce these things. The rules-based order, not so much. What are the rules-based order? Well, the rules-based order are whatever Washington says they are. So when Russia invades Ukraine, it was certainly a violation of international law, because despite the massive years of provocations by the US, by NATO, which were themselves violations of a host of international laws, those provocations did not give, in my view, did not give Russia the right to invade. It was a violation of international law. But that's not what we heard from the US. What we heard was, this is an absolute violation of the rules-based order, which basically says when we want to invade a country, we do so in the name of the rules-based order. We can invade Iraq despite in its moment of glorious opposition, the United Nations refusing to pass a resolution embracing and endorsing that war, to make it legal in the only way that a war is legal, when it's authorized by the Security Council, unless it's immediate self-defense. The US said, we're going to go to war anyway, because the government of Iraq under Saddam Hussein is violating our rules. They're not allowing in the inspectors. And then when the government of Iraq said, we'll let in the inspectors, they said, too late, we're going to war anyway, ha. Because it wasn't based on international law. What Russia is violating, according to the US, is not about international law. It's about the rules-based order. And here you see the rules-based order that we like to talk about in this country these days means respect for territorial integrity, respect for sovereignty, respect for human rights. But that only applies, apparently, to Ukraine. I was listening this morning to the foreign minister of South Africa on a wonderful webinar organized by the Quincy Institute, interestingly. And she said, this rules-based order is defined around these issues of defense of national sovereignty, of territorial integrity, of human rights. And that's appropriate when it's applied to Ukraine. When it's applied to Palestine, she said, it doesn't apply. And it's never seen as being applied equally all around the world. She said it needs to be applied as vigorously when it comes to the Palestinians as when it comes to Ukraine. So Ukraine right now is very much at the centerpiece of this militarization of US foreign policy. And it has to do, as I mentioned earlier, with how the media covers it. It also has to do with a specific set of threats that this war presents that was not true of several other wars. I have a couple of papers that I've published in the last couple of weeks, one in Foreign Policy and Focus, one in The Guardian, one in These Times, looking at why we need a ceasefire and a diplomatic track now, why we have always needed a ceasefire from day one of this war. And some of it has to do with the human cost, the cost to Ukrainian civilians in the tens of thousands, people who have been killed, who have been injured, millions who have been expelled from their homes, half of whom have become refugees in other countries. It's a horrific human toll that's been taken. At the military level, the most recent figures from the Pentagon, I don't know if they're accurate, but they're probably relatively close, is that both Ukraine and Russia have lost in the area of 100,000 troops in these first 8 months of this war. It's astonishing, the human cost of this. And what we need to see in looking at this war, and it's because this war is not only about the war that's being fought on the ground. This war, there's really, as my friend Richard Falk, a wonderful analyst of international law, the way he's defined it, he said there's really two wars underway in Ukraine. One is the war on the ground, in which Russia was clearly the aggressor. The other is a geopolitical war, which has been underway for some years. It has to do with all of the provocations by NATO, by the United States, by the placing of strategic weapons on the border of Russia, all of those things. And in that war, the US is much more the aggressor. But what we're trying to stop instantly is the aggression on the ground, because that's what's causing this enormous human cost to the environment, cost to the global economy, cost to the lives of people in the global south who are suddenly facing massive starvation, all of those things. And most of all, the militarization of all of Europe as a result of this war, and especially the threat of nuclear escalation. And that's not only because Russian leaders are making absolutely reckless threats about using nuclear weapons and other weapons of mass destruction, but because the US, as recklessly or perhaps more so, is in the process of spending what will be $1 trillion over 30 years to upgrade and modernize, that's the term they love, modernize its entire nuclear arsenal. In that context, this war has every bit of danger, more than any that we've seen, as we keep hearing, since the early 60s in the Cuban Missile Crisis, of leading to an actual nuclear exchange. I don't think either the Russian or the US leadership has any intention of planning and plotting out a path to a nuclear war. But I think there is a chance, it's a small chance, but when you're talking about the two largest nuclear powers in the world, any chance that is not zero is way too big. Tiny as it may be, it's way too big. That any, quote, accident on either side could escalate. One of the challenges we're looking at is that unlike other conflicts, for example, during the Cold War, during the global war on terror, for example, when the war began in Syria, and it became clear quickly that the numerous wars that were all being fought to the last Syrian, but involving a variety of both regional and global powers, part of that involved US and Russian-backed troops fighting on opposite sides against each other, and US and Russian planes both engaged directly. So the danger of them taking on each other was very serious. In response to that, the US and Russia immediately put together essentially a hotline. I don't even know if it was by telephone or by computer, whatever it was. It allowed commanders on the ground to reach each other instantly and say, that was a mistake. That was not an escalation. Get your people out of there. Or we're going to be bombing over there. Get your people out. We don't want to kill any of your soldiers. Neither of them, neither Moscow nor Washington seemed to care very much about how many Syrians they killed. But they were very careful not to kill the nationals of the other, because they knew that could have led to an escalation. In Ukraine, we don't have that. We don't have that kind of military to military. That's part of the reason that we need a ceasefire and we need negotiations right away. So I want to wrap up in a minute because I want to give us time for questions and discussion. But I also think that the broad question of militarization is very much one of the consequences we need to look at in the question of Ukraine. We have, for example, the project of Europe, the post-World War II creation of Europe as a unified region. And as it's taken forward in the last 20 or 30 years, with the rise of the euro, with the rise of a borderless territory in so many ways, they've defined it, and this was aspirational, not real, but it was a great aspiration to define Europe as a project of human rights. The creation of the European Court of Human Rights was something you really couldn't imagine, a court that actually had jurisdiction above the national courts of the countries within it. That's extraordinary. All of that is now up for grabs. Europe right now is defining itself not by human rights, aspirationally or otherwise, but by militarism. So you have countries like Sweden and Finland, where the populations once prided themselves on standing outside of the great military conflicts of the Cold War, to say, yes, we want to join NATO. How soon can we get in there? We want to spend a full 2% of our GDP on the military. Germany was never, since World War II, willing to send weapons abroad. Suddenly, they're clamoring to send more weapons to Ukraine and saying, we're going to put 100 billion euros into the military right now, and we're going to move immediately to a 2% role, something that no countries in Europe wanted to do. Suddenly, they can't keep up with the demand on their own governments for militarization. This is going to take decades, maybe generations, to reverse. We are going to pay an incredibly high price for all of this. So I will close with the notion that what we need is, in the immediate, we need a ceasefire and a move towards real diplomacy, but we need an alternative framework, a global framework, a European framework that's based on diplomacy instead of war. We can't go on with a world that is burning, where the planet is burning, where people are dying of pandemics that are spreading throughout the world, where the rise of inequality on such a skyrocketing level that we've never experienced before in the history of humanity is still on the rise in the midst of all of this. We need a different kind of world, and it's going to take an awful lot of work to get there. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Phyllis, for a very provocative presentation. And I'm sure that there are many questions or comments that our listeners might have. For those who are watching on YouTube, you send your question in an email to global.justice.cliff@gmail.com, and I'll pass it on to Phyllis. But those who are here in the Zoom room can ask your question directly. And so if you do have a question or want to make a comment, you can do so by raising your hand, and I'll call on you.
It means everybody agrees with me. Good. They all go out to work.
Yes.
I see a hand.
Dennis?
Did my hand go up? I sure was thinking it. Phyllis, could you, do you have some scenarios in mind for how this change that you talk about, this change that's necessary, could actually happen? It strikes me that the militarism is so baked into our culture. Just even going back as far as Michael Moore's movie on Columbine, where he described the arming of American citizens in the context of our militarized culture and society. And, we were all excited about the peace dividend so long ago now, and, one after another, but we have definitely been on a trajectory opposite of where we need to be and where we thought at one time, in our memory, that we were going, to more of the benefits of having this huge part of our economy available for education, for taking care of each other, just frittered away, and how we continue spending over half of our wealth on militarizing. How can this change at this stage?
Well, it's a huge challenge. There's no one thing. I think that, there's a lot of talk in the anti-war movement, in the peace movement, about how our movement is so hard because we're up against the military-industrial complex. And I always fight back against that. I mean, certainly that's true, but every movement is up against incredibly powerful forces. The environmental justice movement is up against the forces of racism and inequality, up against the forces of the fossil fuel industry. And yeah, so ours is no harder. What we have to do, I think, is something that we saw in this country in the aftermath of the rise of the Black Lives Matter movement, the killing of George Floyd, and the incredible resistance movement that arose in response. We have seen an extraordinary shift, particularly, it was certainly in the public discourse, but also in the media discourse around questions of racism. Every component of it, from the issues of systemic racism that were never part of mainstream media discourse, political discourse where there's fights going on, it's not good. I mean, we're seeing the fights around people that are challenging librarians, allowing discussion of racism, saying you're teaching CRT, right? Critical race theory, which critical race theory, I've read Kimberly Crenshaw, and I barely understand it. It's a really complex concept that's taught in law schools, for God's sakes. It's not taught in kindergarten. But what is taught in kindergarten, and should be, is the history of heroes, whether it's Rosa Parks or Martin Luther King, whoever it is. This is taught in kindergarten, and thank God it is. Thank God there are these fabulous books for children at every stage that you can do that. So that's one part of it. One part of it is the demands, and we saw people get fired. We saw new people get hired in places like who's making movies, who's deciding on how the news gets covered. For a while, I read the Washington Post and the New York Times. I would probably never bother with the Post. Well, I might sometimes, but I wouldn't regularly read the Post if they didn't have the comics. If the Times had comics, I wouldn't bother, but the Post has the comics, so I read the Post first. The view section, the style section of the Post, that's where the comics are. So I read that one first. No, first things first. I have seen over the last, I would say 2 or 3 years in particular, but it started several years ago, an incredible percentage, if you will. If you want to be quantitative about it, articles, whether it's about the role of Black architects. There's a wonderful architectural critic who writes for the Post or the Times. I can't even remember what his name, Philip something. He's writing a lot about the role of architects of color. There's the discussions of every movie have to do with who made it, what are the challenges in terms of who's playing what roles, the questions of representation, the questions of whether it's Oscars so white. These kinds of campaigns not only are happening, but they're getting incredible levels of attention throughout our country. Now, does that mean that systemic racism is over? Oh, no. But it does mean that the possibilities of challenging first components and eventually the reality of systemic racism is at a stronger level than we've seen in probably 2 generations. That's huge. That's huge. The rise of new movements, the movement for trans rights, which has become this powerful movement across the US in the course of, 4 years, 5 years? And it's not an easy one. People often don't know what it means. What are trans rights, But that's okay. They learn, right? Because it's a movement that's on the rise. It's a new movement. This is, I think, what's been so extraordinary. When people talk about intersectionality, what it means is not only the original meaning of it, that it's how all of the different oppressions can impact a single person. So somebody can be Black and disabled and a lesbian woman and face 4 different kinds of oppression that all come together. But it also means it's a way of building movements that deal with all of those oppressions together. It doesn't mean that we can't have movements that are specific to an issue. We can, and most of the time we need to, right? But it does mean that we work with people harder. So those of us who have cut our political teeth and continued to work primarily on issues around war and imperialism and militarism, it's our obligation to write things and give speeches and make films and do all those things, podcasts, everything, that are accessible to the leaders and the activists in all the other movements, not to recruit them and get them to come to our stuff, but to allow them to see to have the tools to educate their own people in their own terms about these connections. So in my office, we have one of our projects is called the National Priorities Project that does incredible work monitoring the US military budget. They're the only ones in the city, as far as I can tell, who actually know how to read the military budget. I certainly don't know how. And one of the things that they did last year, they hired a person just to put together this incredible pamphlet online and in hard copies that's called No Warming, No War. And it's aimed specifically at the climate justice movement, which has its own language, its own jargon, its own approaches. And they said, okay, we'll use that language because this isn't for us. We're not writing it for ourselves. We're writing it for you because we have a bunch of information here that you probably don't have access to. And we're going to make it accessible. And the thing was like hotcakes, it was going on. Everybody loved it because it was designed with and for a whole other movement. That's, I think, how we're going to challenge militarism. Everybody, when I work a lot with the Poor People's Campaign, I work a lot with Reverend William Barber, who I'm sure most of you have heard of, who's an extraordinary leader coming out of the Black church, pulling together a movement, first the Moral Mondays movement, as you know, in North Carolina, and then beginning in 2018, in collaboration with Reverend Liz Theo Harris, the leader of the Kairos committee out of New York, which comes out of the anti-poverty movement. They came together to form the Poor People's Campaign based on the idea that 50 years ago, Martin Luther King led the first Poor People's Campaign in the last months before he was assassinated. So let's look at how we've done. We need an audit of what we've done over 50 years in this country. Are things better? What has gotten worse? And they chose the three things that King based his analysis on of the first Poor People's Campaign, which were militarism, racism, and poverty. And they added climate and said, those are the evils that we need to analyze. And we became their research partners, we at IPS, and we worked with them, and together we produced this book, basically, called The Souls of Poor Folk, that looked at the 50 years since the first Poor People's Campaign. And all of it is about how these things fit together. So if you're talking about ending poverty, you can't talk about ending poverty while economic inequality exists. You can't talk about it while militarism is stealing 53 cents out of every federal dollar. You can't talk about it while the disparities of racism are so extreme that you have entirely different levels of life expectancy, of healthcare, of all these things that are the pieces of evidence of poverty. And of course, there's far more white people who are poor and low wealth because of what is the population of this country. But it's disparities in terms of percentages. It's far higher percentages of people of color who are poor and low wealth than white people. So it's all of those things have to be taken into account. And that's how you build what they call a fusion movement. We can call it fusion, we can call it intersectional, we can call it whatever we want, but it means movements that work together, movements that link the struggle against war, the struggle against militarism, with the struggle against racism, with the struggle against Islamophobia, with the struggle against misogyny, with the struggle against, for trans rights and for environmental justice and for immigrant rights, all together. That's how we do it. We should be able to by next week, don't you think?
We're doomed.
We're doomed. We're not doomed. I see another hand up there too.
We have a question from Kathleen Densmore from San Francisco, and she asks, do you think U.S. pressure is the primary explanation for Sweden and Finland joining NATO and for European countries increasing their military budgets and activities?
I think it's a huge component. Whether it's more important than anything else, I don't know. I mean, European countries and European people have agency. And one of the things that I've found astonishing was even more than the decision by the Swedish and Finnish governments. The Swedish government in particular has a right-wing government at the moment. They don't have their usual social democratic forces in power, but Finland as well. What I found more depressing, I guess, than their decision to join NATO and to raise the amount of money they spend on the military is the fact that public opinion is right there. They're reflecting what their people want. And whether that comes out of US pressure, I think is less likely than the government's decision. So I'm not in a position to judge what's more important, but certainly US pressure has played a role there. That's definitely true.
Mark Ginsburg has his hands up.
Phyllis, thank you very much for, as usual, your wonderful remarks, depressing as they may be, but careful analysis. You mentioned the large leadership role that the U.S. Military spending has compared to other countries. You didn't mention, I would just insert that the number of foreign military bases that the U.S. has, I think it's like 800. I don't think anybody is even above 25 compared to that. But my question is actually about the negotiations or the diplomatic initiatives in relation to Ukraine. I haven't had a chance to read your most recent article, so maybe you've covered this, but I wonder if you have any insights into what happened before the Russian troops crossed the border into Ukraine, when the president of Ukraine, publicly at least, indicated he might be willing to negotiate and even give up the possibility of joining NATO. I mean, what happened behind the scenes there? I can imagine that the U.S. government didn't just listen without some intervention, but I haven't seen anything that describes what happened at that time, because that seemed to me, I mean, I don't know where the negotiations at that point would have gone, but that seemed to me an opportunity that was discarded. And do you have any insights into what happened at that point?
Yeah, I don't have, I mean, I wish somebody had been a fly on the wall of any meetings that went on. It's not clear to me that there were actual negotiations before the invasion began on the 24th of February. Certainly there were public statements by both sides in March within a few weeks, and there were indications. There was the Turkish initiative, there were the old Minsk Accords from earlier that had never been implemented, and that was sort of on Ukraine as much as it was on Russia. Both didn't implement them. I'm not sure they were realistic, I will say, but they existed, and they do provide some kind of a basis for a possible arrangement. The other possibility that was looked at was this notion of, it was the Turkish and somebody else initiative, the idea that there would be a 15-year kicking the can down the road for 15 years around the Donbass and Crimea, and Russia would withdraw away from the parts of Ukraine that they had just taken, which were quite small at that point in those first few weeks. And then in return, Ukraine, as you say, would agree not to join NATO. There was a section of it that said that they would have some kind of protection coming from a list of countries that included all the leading NATO countries. So it was a little bit like, okay, we won't officially be a member of NATO, but we'll be treated like a member of NATO in that if Russia tried anything, NATO would respond as NATO, essentially. And I think at some point the Russians said, wait a minute, this is kind of the same thing of, this is the same problem. So, and there are indications, and there are some claims that it's not true, and I don't have an independent source, so I don't know. There was a lot of discussion about the announcement from Boris Johnson when he went to Kyiv and allegedly said, we are prepared to back you for as long as it takes, and we will, and he said this publicly, and we will not, we will not back down, et cetera, et cetera. In the face of that, I think it made it much harder for Zelensky to consider backing down. The other thing is, I mean, Zelensky himself was not elected to be a war leader, right? He was a comedian, for God's sakes. And he's done an extraordinary job leading a besieged people in a very, very brutal war, an incredibly brutal war. Now, politically, where he stands on all this and how accountable he is to the US and stuff, I don't know. But I do think that he's got some agency too. And I'm sure that his view is, my country has been invaded, my territory is being stolen, and I'm going to mobilize my people to fight. And he's done that. And he seems to have very, very strong support. Now, having said that, I think we don't actually have a clue what percentage of people in Ukraine right now, including those who are fighting incredibly heroically, in fact, against a very brutal occupation, how many of them would say, I will fight to the death to win back my country. I don't care what the price is. Versus how many would say, I just want my family to be safe. I just want to keep my family safe. And I'm not willing to fight and see my children be killed to determine where's going to be the southern border of my country. I don't think we know that. I don't think anybody has polled for it. I don't think anybody will. And I'm sure most people in Ukraine are not even thinking that way. They're thinking we're at war, we have to fight. But, these are really hard questions. This is a terrible war. The impact on civilian life has been horrific. The numbers of casualties. Yes, there are wars with far more casualties, but the speed of those casualties in this war is right up there with the worst of them. So, this is a terrible, terrible war. And that's part of the reason why we need a ceasefire immediately. The US has a history. It's one of the things I write about in my piece in the one in these times. The US has a history of rejecting ceasefires on the grounds that not enough people have died yet. So Condoleezza Rice, famously in 2006, when Israel had invaded Lebanon, and there was a call for an immediate ceasefire, she said, no, we don't need a ceasefire yet. And those weren't her words, but that was her position. The same thing 3 years later in Operation Cast Lead in Gaza. There was a call at the United Nations for an immediate ceasefire. And she was at the United Nations as the Secretary of State and said, no, it's too soon. It's too soon. We don't need a ceasefire until it can be sustainable and permanent, which means at the end of negotiations, not at the beginning of negotiations. So the US has that history, and it's a terrible one. I think we only have time for another question or so. I have a meeting coming up.
Well, I'd like to raise the question of why is it that the United States was so insistent on expanding NATO eastward? I mean, we were warned that it would lead to this back in the 90s.
Yeah.
And even before the invasion of Ukraine occurred, Putin did issue a call for a agreement to demilitarize the border states, and it was ignored. Why is it that the U.S. is so insistent on expanding NATO at cost that it has resulted in?
Yeah, I mean, there's no easy answer to that one, and it's not a short one. So I'm just going to say the quick answer is, the U.S. saw post-Soviet Russia as being qualitatively weakened, saw it as an opportunity to expand its influence around the world, to have greater economic power, greater military capacity, the expansion of military bases, all of those things, the 800 bases that we talk about, many of them are across Europe. And I mean, I think we have to be careful. I don't take everything that Putin says seriously. Whether those were serious offers of demilitarization, I think is a big question. So that doesn't surprise me that it was not taken seriously in other places either. I mean, he is presiding over an incredibly reactionary government. But I think the US provocations, as you say, these were known provocations. We didn't know exactly what the response would be, but we knew there would be responses that could become very dangerous. And the US, partly because it spends that much amount of money on its military, thinks that it is invincible. Part of the irony here is that this is one of the great lessons for the anti-war forces across our country, that even spending 53 cents of every federal dollar for so many years, it didn't work. It didn't prevent Russia from invading Ukraine. That's the lesson here. Military force doesn't work. That's why we need diplomacy. It's why we need to empower the United Nations and not to empower NATO. Those of us who have been in the No to NATO movement, that started in 1991, the last time I was tear gassed actually was a No to NATO protest in Strasbourg, and this has been going on for years to try and say, look, whatever you think of NATO's origins in the post-World War II period, it was done in 1991. It should have been demolished. There was no reason to have a NATO at that point. Instead, what did we get? We got the expansion of NATO. We got NATO leading a war in Kosovo, leading a war in Afghanistan, leading especially the war in Libya, outside of the defensive posture that it was supposed to be about. So yeah, NATO should be gone, but wishing it doesn't make it happen. So the US is still trying to expand its power. That's what was going on. Thank you.
Are there any further questions anyone wants to raise?
I've got to go.
Yeah. Well, I want to thank you, Phyllis, for a very interesting presentation.
Thank you.
I hope everyone enjoyed it as much as I did. This webinar, as well as past programs, are available on our website at www.globaljusticecenter.org. And I hope you'll join us again next week for our webinar with Nancy Fraser on her new book, Cannibal Capitalism. So for now, let me thank our webinar team, Liz Mestris, Gregory Diamond, Roberto Robles, Olivia Canales, Bob Stone, Betsy Bowman, and myself. And now, this is Cliff Durand signing off. Thank you.
Thank you.